Welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here and submit your question for a future episode. Got some good questions this week. Let's talk about it. And this first question I'm going to throw over to my friend Alex Enfiegin from Worship Ministry Training to answer. So Alex, take it away.
Hey, I'm Alex from Worship Ministry Training, and here is the question. How big does a worship team need to be to consider adding a music director? And what's the difference between a worship leader and a music director? Great question. I'm actually going to start with the differences between the two roles, and then I'll tell you how big your team should be before you consider adding a music director. So let's just start with some big picture differences between the two roles. The worship leader's job is focused on helping the congregation pour out their praise to God. The music director's job is focused on helping the band and the singers play and sing with undistracting excellence so that the congregation can focus on the Lord. In other words, the worship leader is focusing on the church and on the Lord, and the music director is focusing on the band and on the singers to help them help the church focus on the Lord. So they're kind of pointed in different directions. The worship leader towards the church and the Lord, the music director towards the band and the singers. The worship leader is focused more on the spiritual, and the music director is focused more on the musical. Now, there can be some overlap, and there should be some overlap, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, some of the things a worship leader should be doing is he or she should be setting the spiritual tone of the service. That's really the thrust of their responsibility and their ministry, is to set the spiritual tone of the service. And that includes things like imparting spiritual insights to the team or leading the team through team devotions. It includes building Christ-exalting, theologically rich and accurate worship sets, so they're paying attention theologically to the songs that the church is singing. It includes things like greeting the church and welcoming them warmly and being that upfront pastoral figure, or starting the worship service with scripture and prayer, also known as a call to worship. It involves leading the congregation in song and following the Holy Spirit during musical worship. Those are the things, the tasks, the responsibilities that a worship leader would be fulfilling on a regular basis. Now, the music director is going to do other types of tasks. The music director's primary responsibility is to ensure that the band executes the worship leader's vision with precision. The worship leader is the primary driver or visionary, but the music director is the executor. He's the one or she's the one that makes things happen the way that the worship leader intends. And so the tasks and responsibilities of a music director might involve some of these things: scheduling the band, scheduling the vocalists, providing the team with MP3s and chord charts and tutorials and resources to practice, sending detailed arrangement notes to the musicians like, hey, guitar player, please learn this guitar line. Hey, vocalist, please make sure you learn these 3 harmonies. It involves building the backing tracks if your church uses backing track software. It involves working out vocal harmony parts either in advance or during the rehearsal. It involves correcting musical mistakes and resolving any clashing parts during the rehearsal. And the music director will also guide the band through challenging transitions or trouble spots during the actual service. Now, you might be saying, Alex, this sounds like what I'm already doing as a worship leader. And if that's true, you are probably like most worship leaders, where you're fulfilling both roles. You are both the spiritual shepherd and the musical director in one. And that is a very common thing. In fact, for the first 15 years of my ministry, I did both roles at all the churches I served at. It wasn't until I started serving at a church of 10,000 that I thought, well, all the other big churches use a music director, so I should develop one here. And so I actually learned how to develop a music director position at my large church. And at my new church, it's about 1,200 people. We use a music director as well. And I'll tell you why it's helpful to have both roles. And you don't just need to be a mega church to have a music director. I'll tell you in a second about what size church makes sense to have a music director. But just because you're a good worship leader doesn't mean you are good at understanding music, right? Sometimes a worship leader is a great singer, but they don't have any guitar or piano or arrangement or production skills, learning how to layer all the parts of the band together. Sometimes a music director has all the musical skills, but none of the pastoral heart side of things. Or maybe they're not that spiritually deep or rich. And so if you're a worship leader who can do both roles, great. You're even more valuable. But if you're a worship leader who can only do like the singing side of things, then you're going to want a music director on your team to help the band and arrange parts and take care of all the musical stuff that you perhaps don't understand, because maybe you're more of a shepherd and a pastor. But just because a music director is musically qualified to lead a band doesn't mean that they're spiritually qualified to lead a church either. And so there is a distinction between the two. Sometimes someone's just gifted at music, but they're spiritually inept. I mean, obviously, we want all people on our teams to be spiritually deep, but a music director might not have the theological training or might not want to be up front. So a music director doesn't always turn into a great worship leader, and a worship leader doesn't always turn into a great music director, but sometimes a worship leader can fulfill the role of a music director. I hope that makes sense. Now, if you're in a small church, I still think you can have a music director. And there are a few reasons I think why. Number one, it'll help take a load off of your shoulders. If you can develop somebody who's musically gifted to manage all of the band scheduling and to create all the resources and to do all this different stuff for you that you don't want to do or necessarily need to do, why not? Why not develop a music director who can focus more on the musicians? So I would say if you're in a small church, you should still consider having a helper who really takes on this role. The other great thing about having a music director is if you have in-ear monitors, and that's very important, you cannot really have a music director if you don't have in-ear monitors, and I'll explain why in a second. If you have in-ear monitors, your music director can guide your band through the transitions, the breaks, the trouble spots. If someone gets lost, he can call the chords out during service. So as the worship leader, you're singing and leading the church, but your music director is helping guide the band so that things sound tighter, that people don't miss important musical moments, the breaks are all solid, all that stuff. It's really helpful to have a music director, and that can be beneficial regardless of your church size. That is a helpful role if you're in a church of 50 or 500,000. It doesn't matter. That position is very useful to have on your team. And I actually have a course inside my academy that will teach you everything you need to know to develop the music director position at your church. So check that out if Spencer puts a link below. But I would say that you can use a music director regardless of what size your team is. Now, if it's just you and a cajon player on the little box thing, then you probably don't need a music director. But if it's any bigger than 3 to 5 people, then a music director position will come in handy. Like I said, they can handle all the scheduling, they can put the resources into planning center for you, or help with arrangements, or guide them through the services. You just need to have the in-ear monitors. And so hopefully this answer helps you. I will be releasing an even more in-depth answer on my channel in the near future, probably in the next couple months, where I'm really going to break down all of the differences. But thank you, Spencer, for letting me encourage your people. And for the viewer, God bless you. Keep serving the Lord with excellence and humility.
Thanks so much for answering that question, Alex. If you don't know Alex yet, you better get to know him because he has an amazing YouTube channel that actually talks about a lot of the same stuff that I talk about. So check that out. I'll link it down in the description below. It's called Worship Ministry Training. And also make sure to check out Alex's Academy where you can learn more about how to lead worship. I've gotten to know Alex over the past few years, really, and he's a great guy, great worship leader. Can't recommend him enough. So check his stuff out. I'll link it all down in the description below. If you have multiple people who can fill a role on your worship team, for example, 3 drummers, and the most skilled one is unavailable for midweek rehearsal while the other 2 can attend, would you still schedule the one who can't make it, knowing that he may actually play better without rehearsal than the others would with it? For context, we don't have a strict rule requiring attendance at rehearsal to play on Sunday, and we do have a Sunday morning run through before the first service. Kevin. All right, there's a couple things that I need to break down here because, first of all, your context is different than my context because I require people to show up for midweek rehearsal. And I want to talk about why that is. And it's not primarily to learn the songs. That's a part of it. But the other part of it is that there's so much that happens at our midweek rehearsal that I don't want any worship team member to miss out on, because at our midweek rehearsals, yes, we run through the songs and we figure out how to best play them for Sunday, and it gives people a chance to run through them. But that's not the only thing that happens at our rehearsals. The reason ultimately that I have a requirement for worship team members to be at midweek rehearsal is, yes, I want them to be there to learn their songs, but also there's so much team building, strengthening your team dynamic that happens at those midweek rehearsals, at least at my midweek rehearsals. That's why I want them there, because being on the worship team for me isn't just about learning how to play the song. So at the end of the day, if you can play the song really well, that's great. I want that, but that's not the only thing that I want out of my worship team members. I want them to be able to work well with the worship team. I want to have a chance to pour into them spiritually. And so I suppose that doesn't all need to happen at midweek rehearsals. And that's why I want to contextualize my answer, because for me, that's how I've set up my ministry, is that those things, not that they don't happen at other times during the week as well, but primarily the regular routine of pouring into my team spiritually and their relationship as a worship team being built happens at our midweek rehearsals. And that's why I want my team members to be at midweek rehearsal. So I'll start with saying that because that in your question, your question, Kevin, is basically, I have somebody who's really good at playing drums and they don't need to be at rehearsal, but they can still show up on Sunday and they know how to play the songs. And I just want to challenge you to think, is that the only thing that I want out of my drummer? Or are there other elements of being on the worship team that need to be developed as well, spiritually and relationally? It reminds me of my worship rehearsal blueprint, which I'll link down in the description below. What do I always say when I talk about that? I say, I'm going to teach you how to lead a worship rehearsal that leads your team well musically so that they know how to play the songs on Sunday, but also spiritually so that they grow closer to God, and relationally so that they grow closer to each other. So the musical side of it is only 1/3 of the equation. We also want to be pouring into them spiritually, pouring into them relationally so that they grow closer to God, and they also grow closer as a cohesive unit, which will help them lead your church better whenever they function as a band. So if you're a worship leader and your worship rehearsals don't fulfill that function, they're only the musical side, check out the worship rehearsal blueprint. I'll link it down in the description below, and you can see what those other sides of development might look like. Now, let's actually answer the question, which is, would you still schedule the person who can't make it? And I'm going to assume here that you're not talking about like, I'm going to schedule them every week because they're the best drummer, and we're going to leave the other two drummers on the sideline because they aren't as good, even though they can come to practice. I think you're saying, should I include them in the regular rotation even though they can't come to rehearsal? And this is why it's hard for me to answer, is because my expectation for my worship team, for everything that I just talked about, all those reasons, is that they would be able to regularly come to worship rehearsals. And so to contextualize it for you, if you have a way to develop them spiritually and relationally with your other worship team members outside of a midweek rehearsal, and you don't have that strict rule of requiring midweek rehearsal to play on Sunday, then I suppose you could still schedule them. Do I think that's the wisest way to do it? No, not necessarily. Because just imagine what that communicates to the other two drummers. Think of the conversation that you're going to have with those other two drummers at some point, or some other person on your team, where there's somebody who joins your team who's not as musically gifted as this drummer is, and they need to be at midweek rehearsals. And what are you going to say? It seems like a difficult conversation when they come up to you and you say, hey, I'm sorry, we can't have you play on Sunday because you weren't at rehearsal this week. And really what you're saying is you're not musically talented enough to be able to play on Sunday without coming to midweek rehearsal. And then if I'm that person, I'm thinking, this drummer over here, he doesn't come to midweek rehearsals. Why doesn't he have to come on Wednesdays or whenever it is? And so it seems like it creates this unequal expectation for worship team members, and I get why it's there. It's because somebody's more skilled than the other, which is just a fact of life. And I might be more lenient with the drummer who can't come to rehearsal, but I still want them to come on a regular basis because of the other things that I talked about. And I do this sometimes with my worship team members. If there's a worship team member who consistently comes to rehearsal all the time, and then there's one worship rehearsal that they can't make, but they're available on Sunday, I'll still let them play. I'm not like hard and fast with my rule that you must be at that specific rehearsal or else you can't play on Sunday. But what I always tell my worship team members is the reason we have our midweek rehearsal on a regular basis is so that if by chance some week we can't have that midweek rehearsal, we know that we've put in the work ahead of time and we don't need to rely on that midweek rehearsal for that 1 week to be prepared to lead on Sunday. And so with all of that context, personally, if someone can't come to midweek rehearsal for the worship team at my church on a regular basis, then I would say this isn't the season for you to serve in the worship ministry, because it's not just about being able to play well musically. There's at least two other sides of it. Musical side is one, but then spiritually and relationally as well, that we need to think about when it comes to worship team members on our team. And like I said, if you don't have a way to develop those other two sides, spiritual and relational, then check out the worship rehearsal blueprint. I'll link it down in the description below. It's a 5-piece blueprint to the perfect worship rehearsal that will lead your team well musically so they know how to play the songs for Sunday, spiritually so that they grow closer to God, and relationally so that they grow closer to each other. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.